to the caterer. He didn't ask me to. He's not paying for this, but he deserves a plug. His stuff is very good. The catering business in Gush Etzion is called Prohibition Pickle. Interesting name, and that's his produce. So we'll see how it is. I haven't tasted it, but I'm sure it's good. So I have here one volume of a 2-volume set called Sfarim HaChitzonim. Anyone know what Sfarim HaChitzonim are? People familiar with this term?
From the Tanakh.
Outside the Tanakh, yes. All these writings, and there are various types of works included in this, under this title, under this term of Sfarim HaChitzonim, are from the period of Beit Sheni, from the Second Temple period. Now, we have a statement in the Mishnah in Masechet Sanhedrin that Kol HaKoreh B'Sfarim HaChitzonim Ein Lo Chelek L'Olam Haba. The question is, what Sfarim HaChitzonim are being referred to in this statement? It doesn't make a great deal of sense to claim that a work that simply describes the historical events that took place at a certain period in time, in the period of Beit Sheni. Beit Sheni, for those who don't know, is roughly the period from, roughly the year 500 BCE till the year 70 BC. There are also arguments about that, but let's just say that's the time frame. If a book is simply describing the historical events, why would it be, from a religious, from a theological perspective, why would it be problematic to read such a sefer? You could claim that maybe that it's more important to learn other things. It's more important to learn the Tanakh, to learn Torah She'Ba'al Peh, the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Talmudim, whatever, Rashi, Rambam, Rabbeinu Tam, etc. The list is very long. You might say that, and you would be right. It is more important. We do have to spend most of our time studying such things. But it still does not make sense that the Chachamim would say that he who reads Sefarim Hitzonim, which are just historical records, has no Helek L'Olam Haba, which also should be understood that it's not to be taken literally, as there are a number of statements which use that turn of phrase which cannot be and should not be taken literally, but it means it's an admonition not to do something. It's a clear admonition not to do this thing, highly not recommended. Just as there are other statements in Hazal where it says if you do such and such, you're over ba'aseh, you're contravening a positive mitzvah of the Torah, even though it's clear it's not minat Torah, it's midarabanan. A classic example is a bracha levatala, where it says in the Talmud that you say a bracha levatala is over ba'aseh shelot tisa. But the fact is that most of the Rishonim, Rabbeinu Tam, the Ran, many others, prove conclusively that it's not minat Torah. So what does that mean? It means that it's an admonition not to do something. It's being stated in strong terms, but not every statement can be or should be taken at face value, word literally. That's one thing to keep in mind. So what other kinds of sefarim exist within this context that can be referred to as Sefarim Hitzonim? Yes.
Well, it depends who you hold by. There's two opinions from what I understand. There's the opinion that says it's mamash the Sefer Chitzonim, like Ben Sirah and Yudit and things like that, and there's also another opinion that says it refers to works like Homer, if I recall correctly.
Homer?
Homeros?
What Hazar referred to as Homeros? That's not a Sefer Chitzoni, that's Chochmah Yewanith, that's Greek literature, wisdom, writings. That's not Sefer Chitzoni. Sefer Chitzoni is referring to works written usually in Hebrew by Jews. Not something that some ancient Greek called Homer wrote about the Iliad and the Odyssey and Cyclops and all sorts of interesting notions.
So then that's not what it was referring to in forget which Masechta it was in the Yerushalmi. It was referring to. Am I misunderstanding the machloket, or was there not a machloket at all? Or
Sfarim Haisoniyim, as I understand it, refers to basically sectarian writings, okay, such as various writings of the Isiim, the Essenes. There were many sects. We don't know about all of them. We know almost nothing about some of them. There were probably others we don't even know about today, because their works and their attitude, their approach and their opinions and their practices simply did not survive. We happen to know a fair bit about the Isiim and a few others. But now, what do we find in some of these writings? We find various religious notions. First of all, you take a book like Sefer Hanoch, the book of Enoch. It should also be pointed out that some of these writings, many of them, are included to this day in some versions of the Christian Bible, amongst the Catholics, amongst the Orthodox.
Only the Catholics.
Sorry?
Just the Catholics.
No, the Orthodox also, the Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox. They also, not the Protestants. You're right, but Copts as well. Yes, the Copts as well. That's right. The more ancient renditions of Christianity in their Bibles, they have some of these books, including, as we're about to discuss, Sefer Hashmonaim. Interestingly enough, which is actually a good thing, because without them having preserved these books, we would simply not have them.
Is it a sort to read it from a Christian Bible? Do we need to have a Jewish version, or?
If you can understand the ancient Greek or Latin, go for it. More power to you. But most people cannot. I studied Latin, but it's probably very rusty by now, and I wouldn't trust myself to be able to get very far, even reading the Latin, the Vulgata version. Ancient Greek, I admit to my chagrin that I did not study, so I wouldn't get very far at all. But these works were translated into Hebrew, as we're about to discuss. But first I want to explain what kinds of Sefarim Hisonim I think we're being referred to in the Mishnah and Sanhedrin. You have, for instance, the book of Sefer Hanoch, the book of Enoch, which is a strange work, which basically is a recapitulation of Sefer Bereshit with all kinds of additional material and stories and ideas, what have you. And these are not ideas that you can trust. You can put your faith in, and we should not think otherwise. And usually they mislead people and confuse people and lead them astray. And that is why the Chachamim were opposed to people reading such works. But such works were extant. They were not unknown. They were out there. You could fairly easily find them. You could read them. But the Chachamim didn't think it was correct for the vast majority of people to know or to see these books or to read them. So they told people to stay away from them. So you have a book like that. You also have a book like Sefer HaYoveloth or Yovelim, which is also full of all kinds of strange ideas and stories about Hanoch and about other things and angels, and this angel said this and told this to Hanoch and said this to that person, and all sorts of ideas and opinions regarding the calendar, how the calendar should be organized. So all these things are in clear contradiction, standing clear contradiction to the Torah Sheba'al Peh that we received from the Perushim, from the Chachamim Mishnah wa Talmud. It is those books, I believe, that are being referred to in that Mishnah. However, if we discuss a book like Sefer HaMaccabees or Sefer Hashmonaim, there are actually 4 books that are referred to by that name, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, and Daled. Gimel really has nothing to do with the period of the Hashmonaim, but Aleph, Bet, and Daled all pertain to some aspects of that historical period. Here you're talking about historical text. At least Hashmonaim Aleph is a purely historical text. It's reliable, it's authentic, It's full of important historical information, much of which can be confirmed by comparing to other sources. Yosef Matityahu, Josephus Flavius, apparently also had before him Hashmonaim Aleph, and probably other sources as well. And he also adds certain facts that do not appear in those writings. When speaking about historical books, you would be surprised, lichora, to hear that Chazal say it's you should, under no circumstances know anything about what happened at the time of the Hashmonaim. Why would they say such a thing? We'll speak more about what it tells us, what we find there, but why would they even say such a thing? Well, let us begin with the following fact, that Yosef Matityahu, Josephus Flavius, writes in his histories, I believe it's at near the beginning of his account of what he calls the war with the Jews, the Milchemet HaYehudim. In other words, his account of the revolt against the Romans, which began in the year 67, according to the Gregorian calendar, ending in the Hurban. He relates that the encouragement, the impetus, the inspiration for this revolt against the Romans definitely stemmed from the Jewish people's historical memory and connection to the revolt of the Hashmonaim, the Maccabees, the events of Hanukkah, which were many years before. We'll speak about the chronology and the timeline in a moment. But the memory of those revolts, which in the long run were successful, it wasn't a simple process, but they were successful eventually, and it led to an independent Jewish state in large parts of Eretz Yisrael for, practically speaking, for about 80 years. It was the knowledge of that history and the inspiration that the Jewish people drew from that it's possible to rise up against a huge empire like the Greeks and succeed, encouraged them to do the same with regards to the Romans. And this, I think, is the key to understanding why it seems, although we don't have an explicit statement in Chazal to this effect, but it seems that the Hachamim, or many of the Hachamim at least, over time, and I'm referring to the period after the revolt of Bar Kokhba, the Bar Kokhba revolt, which took place between the years 132 and 135 approximately, according to the Gregorian calendar. It was understood by many of the Chachamim that it was necessary, not desirable, but necessary, to hide from view all the texts, all the books that wrote about the Hashmonaim and the revolts against the Greeks and the victories and the success. They couldn't completely delete all that national memory. The fact is, we still say to this day, "Ala nisim, wala gevurot, wala teshuot, wala milhamot, wala peduth." And we say it in every tefillah, we say it in every Birkat Hamazon, we say Hallel for 8 days, we light candles for 8 days. So it's not as if we forgot all these things completely. It's not possible to forget it completely. But it seems that the Hachamim, particularly after that revolt of Bar Kokhba, which unfortunately was eventually crushed completely, and the outcome of that revolt was disastrous. The destruction and the price the Jewish people paid was much greater than that as a result of the Great Revolt before the Hurban. The Roman historian, I think his name was Dios Cassius or something like that.
Cassius Dio.
Cassius Dio, that's the one, thank you. That's right. The other way around. So he writes that 900 and I think he says 80, or I think it says 980, something like that. Just under 1,000 towns and villages, Jewish places of settlement in Eretz Yisrael, were razed to the ground and destroyed. he talks about something like 400,000 Jews being killed as a result of that revolt, the crushing of that revolt, and approximately the same number being captured and sold into slavery. I think in terms of the population at that time, how many Jews there could have been, I don't know exactly how many there were, but even if you imagine there were 2 or 3 or even more million Jews at that time, that's an unbelievable percentage of a tremendous destruction. The word Shoah, although I don't think it's appropriate, because the word Shoah really implies something which is sudden and beyond human control, nothing to do with human agency. But the word would not be out of place. So. So what I think happened was, and this is not just my opinion, this is the opinion of many historians and people who have studied these matters, is that it became the consensus amongst the Hachamim that the less the Jews know for now about these things, the better, because as we would say in Hebrew, od mered kazeh ve'avadnu, another revolt like that and we're finished. In other words, we cannot afford the luxury of another revolt like that. I'm sure it was not an easy decision, or it was not a policy that was adopted lightly, but it seems that was the policy that was adopted. And therefore, these books, the books of the Hashmonaim and other works probably that of an historical nature, were simply pushed to the side and ignored. And when you don't copy books in ancient times and people not studying them, they disappear quite quickly. But they did exist in the Jewish world, and that fact is borne out, if by nothing else, by the fact that the Christians had them. Where did the Christians get them from? Where did the Catholic Church, where did the Christians in Rome have all of a sudden a book about the Maccabees? And where did the Orthodox Christians have such a thing from? And the Copts and what have you? Because it was in the Jewish world. It was part, if it wasn't officially part of the Tanakh, but it was there. It was being read. It was known. But it was then, as I'm explaining now, it was suppressed basically. So the history of that period of our history, that Second Temple period, was suppressed and was preserved only in the Christian versions of the Bible, in Greek translation, and apparently Hashmonaim Aleph and probably the others as well, or many of the others were written originally in Hebrew, but they were translated into Greek and also into Latin, and that's how we receive them, that's how we have them, and they had to be, if we want to read them, we have to translate them back. So we continue. So your question was, what are these books? They're known as the Sefarim Ahisonim, literally the external or apocryphal books that were left out of the Tanakh, that were not included in the Tanakh. So we were speaking about the fact that there are actually two kinds of texts, two kinds of works that are included under this general term. One is our sectarian writings, written by Jews who were not disciples of Chazal, of the Hachamim that we find mentioned in Masechet Avot, shall we say, in the first parak. Or maybe they were to some extent, or even to a very large extent, but they also had their own ideas which they liked to express, to write down. Jews are very creative people. You can't prevent Jews from writing things. It's never going to work. Jews are always writing things. Hopefully good things, but sometimes not so good, or problematic, or complicated, shall we say. So with regards to those that have some where one can discern theological ideological problems. I think those were the books that were being referred to. However, historical books, which are just relating the events as they took place, and Sefer Hashmonaim or Maccabees Aleph is no doubt it's accepted by all historians, all people who have researched this period of history and these texts, that it is the most authentic and historical and precise text that we have on the subject. It's very possible, very likely in fact, that it was written by a soldier in the army of Yehuda Maccabee, or a disciple or a follower of his, or someone who was quite close to him, or something like that, because he seems to have been quite literally on the spot and seen things with his own eyes. And there's no mention of any no supernatural miracle is mentioned in Maccabees Aleph at all. In Maccabees Bet there are some strange additions, interpolations of miraculous events, which I would tend to discount. But there's also much historical information there as well, which fills in some of the gaps which exist in Hashmonaim Aleph. So the historical works are in a different category. And it seems that there was a deliberate policy on the part of the Hachamim after Mered Bar Kochva to suppress these kinds of texts, so that the Jewish people would not be inspired to try and revolt again. And despite this fact, the Jewish people did revolt again after Mered Bar Kochva. There were many revolts all the way up to Byzantine times. Not on the same scale as the Bar Kochva revolt, true, or the Great Revolt, but there were many attempts. There was the famous Mered HaTefutzot, the diaspora revolt, where most of the Jews in the Roman Empire revolted against the Romans and caused them no end of trouble. For which reason, some people, for example, Dr. Hagi Ben Artzi, who is a historian, who's written a very important work on this period of history, the Hashmonaim period, called Megillat Hanukkah, which I highly recommend that everyone get. I'm not aware of an English translation of it. He wrote it in Hebrew, but if there isn't one, there should be one, and there probably will be. But you can get together with someone who knows Hebrew, and you should study it. He did a wonderful job. He took all the historical texts, so that's basically Hashmonaim Aleph, Bet and Daled, mainly Aleph, and the writings of Yosef and Matityahu, where you have certain other facts and what have you filled in, which expand and explain things in a different way and will add information. And he paraphrased it all and also kept it more concise and user-friendly for most people. And the language is also such that most Hebrew speakers can quite readily read it and understand it. The translation here is a very nice translation, but it's almost like reading Tanakh for many Israelis, so they just find it very difficult to work their way through. There are 16 chapters in Hashmonaim Aleph, for example, and each one for the average Israeli is tough going. He wrote it in a much more popular style, not completely, the vernacular as spoken in the Shuk, but a Hebrew that most people will readily understand. And he divided this Megillah that he wrote into 8 chapters. So you can read one perek per day of Hanukkah. He, for example, relates. Some of you, or many of you, may not know who he is, but you should, because he is in fact the brother-in-law of someone that you have heard of, called Binyamin Netanyahu. His wife, Binyamin Netanyahu's wife, Sarah Netanyahu, is his sister. Their family name is Ben Artzi. Their father was some kind of, they were not a religious family, but very, very ideologically motivated, very nationalistic. He relates, for example, Hagi Ben Artzi, I believe he's 73 years old today or something like that, which I think is the same age as Netanyahu, I believe. He relates about himself that in his home on Hanukkah, as a child, as a teenager, his father would read with them 2 chapters of Hashmonaim Aleph every night. So 16 chapters. They would cover that whole book during the days of Hanukkah. So he began to know this, be familiar with this text from a very early age. But he said, actually, you should know there's more to it than this. And this is what I'm going to explain in a moment, how things have changed over time. The Jewish people's awareness or lack of awareness of these texts and how much they are learned. So Hazal apparently, because of the historical realities, decided it was a good idea that Jews don't read this right now, because the Jews really didn't like the Romans, and that's not difficult to understand. The Romans were a very particularly nasty bunch, just about the worst bunch, the worst empire that ever existed, more or less, and they existed for 600 odd years, which is a pretty good innings, as we say, in some versions of the English language. Very longevous empire, very powerful, extremely cruel, and they crushed everybody who got in their path. The Jews caused them more trouble than anybody else, and this went on for a period of you could say 200 years, but it's actually more. It's more like 400 years, because if you take the period of time when the Romans entered Eretz Yisrael in 66, if I'm not mistaken, BCE, Pompeius entered Eretz Yisrael at that time. Because of civil war and agitation that was going on here in Eretz Yisrael, and they were almost invited basically by one side to come in and put things in order. Of course, once the Romans got someone, they didn't leave. So they walked in 66 BC and they stayed, and it became part of the Roman Empire. The Bar Kokhba revolt, which ended at 135, well, you can do the mathematics, that's roughly 200 years. But really it went on to the end of the Roman Empire, which is another 200 years or more. So for 400 years, on and off, the Jews caused the Romans a tremendous amount of trouble. And this can also be seen in the historical events that took place after the Bar Kokhba revolt had been crushed. Because, interestingly enough, Hadrian, Adrianus, as Chazal call him, Hadrian, the emperor who crushed the Bar Kokhba revolt, he tried to vent all of his rage and anger on the Jewish people. So there were all kinds of persecutions, religious persecutions. The study of Torah was banned, and once again, there's an interesting point to do with Berith Milah, circumcision, whether it was banned after the revolt, whether it was actually one of the reasons for the revolt. That's not actually clear. The historians haven't figured this out exactly, but it was around that time. There were tremendous persecutions known as the Hadrianic persecutions. But later, the Roman Emperor Antoninus, known as by Chazal by the same name, Antoninus Pius, he's known, the pious. He was quite positively disposed to the Jewish people. He was on very good terms with Rabbeinu HaKadosh, right? Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the author of the redactor of the Mishnah. It seems that the Romans decided that these Jews are such trouble that we're going to have to try and reach some kind of modus vivendi with them, and we won't be able to crush them. They're too fanatical and too dedicated to whatever it is these crazy ideas they have about one invisible God and all sorts of strange things, and they refuse to bow down to our idols, which no one else has refused to do, so why would they, etc., etc. Yet this is what they do, and they cause us tremendous trouble. The Bar Kokhba revolt was a tremendous blow for the Romans, by the way. The letter which the generals who crushed the revolt, which ended in Bethar, right? Beth Tor, actually, which is not in Gush Etzion, right? Or near Gush Etzion. Yeah, it's part of Gush Etzion, basically. When they sent their letter to the Roman Senate announcing the fact that they were victorious, they did not use the usual wording. The usual wording in Latin was, to the Roman Senate from so-and-so, we are victorious, and I and my legions we're okay. The words "I and my legions are okay" were not in that letter, because they weren't okay. because entire legions were destroyed, which was almost unheard of till that point in Roman history. It only happened about 3 times. It happened here, at the time of Bar Kokhba, that entire Roman legions were destroyed. They just were wiped off the manpower list. They disappear. They're not mentioned again. It's clear that they were wiped out. It happened in Scotland. The Picts wiped out, I think it was the 9th Legion. That was a tremendous blow. It never happened to them before either, really. And it happened in Germany. It happened in Germany with as they called them, the barbarians. Not entirely undeserved name, but that's how they referred to everybody, really. There was a German young man who was taken as a hostage and brought up as a Roman, and he knew how the Romans fought, and he knew how to, and eventually he turned coat and he fought for his Germanic ancestors, and he managed to wipe out a whole legion, or even 2, I think, perhaps, in the forests of Germany. So those are the 3 occasions that I'm familiar with, at least. It didn't happen very frequently. Because he managed to draw them into a trap, and they had to wind their way through the forest, and they couldn't fight in formation as they used to in that situation. So they could cut them, they could pick them off, cut them into little pieces, and pick them off, and they did. So the Romans learned the hard way that the Jewish people are a tough nut to crack. So Antoninus was positively disposed towards the Jews, and he, in fact, went as far as to announce that the Jewish religion was now henceforth a protected religion in the Roman Empire, the exact opposite of what Hadrian had tried to do, which was to eradicate Yahadut, to eradicate the Jewish people's beliefs and their culture and their civilization. Antoninus comes along and says, you know what? You're a protected religion. You can learn Torah, you can redact a Mishnah, and I'll even help you out. And he did, financially. He even helped out Rabbi financially. As long as you keep the peace. And that seems to be the result of their difficult experiences with the Jewish people being so rebellious and also so good at fighting them. So the Jewish people. האמת היא שאני לא מכיר את זה.
חשבתי שיש לי
מעניין. אני אשמח לראות את זה אחר כך. תודה. So the Jewish religion became, from that point on, talking about roughly the time of Rabbi Kadosh, it was a protected religion, and was actually looked up to by many Gentiles in the Roman world. Interestingly, and this is also probably one of the reasons that Christianity also therefore took hold within the Roman world, because after all it comes from a similar source, a source which is close to Torah, close to Judaism, so it wasn't totally foreign, and it sounded similar to those Jews. Maybe it's a bit easier. There's no miswot. You don't have to do circumcision. There's all kinds of things you don't have to do. So it's a better deal. So we already have basically described 2 historical periods with reference to these books of the Hashmonaim and other similar historical sources. The initial period was that the Jewish people were completely aware and terribly enthused and celebrated about the events of Hanukkah, enthused about those events and celebrated those events every year, and they had books that even described to them what had happened. So when they said in Tefillah, ala nisim, ala gevurot, ala milhamoth, they knew what they were talking about. They'd seen, they'd heard, they'd read about these things. And it even encouraged them to revolt against the Romans. But because of the disastrous outcome, the Chachamim decided, right now we have to keep a low profile. So these books should be pushed to the side. So that was the second period. Initially these books were there in Hebrew, people were reading them, and then they were hidden from view. And that's how it remained for 1900 odd years, shall we say, until the Zionist movement came along. The Zionist movement, of course, was all about reconstituting Jewish national existence. I'm not even going to say explicitly it was all about establishing a Jewish state, because that was actually not explicitly mentioned as part of the original Zionist platform. The first time this claim was actually made officially, if I'm not mistaken, that we want an independent Jewish state that will be independent and exist in its own right, not as part of any other political framework such as the British Empire, because there were people, including Zev Jabotinsky, who was quite happy that the state that be established here would be part of the British Empire or the British Commonwealth, as it's called today, correct? So we would be like Australia or Canada or New Zealand or what have you. That was considered quite a reasonable proposition till around the beginning, even later than the beginning of the Second World War. I think the first time it was officially announced that we want an independent state, I think was actually mentioned in a Zionist conference in a hotel in New York City in 1941, if I'm not mistaken. Around that time, anyhow. So, the Zionists needed heroes, which makes sense. The Jewish people had not been a military people, had not expressed that side of their psyche and their being, their national existence for a long time, and you needed to build up this image of Jews can fight and win, and we're not pushovers. So you have the heroes of the Tanakh, like David HaMelech and Shimshon HaGibor, but they were looking for more. And they had this tremendous source, these books of the Hashmonaim, describing a very long, as I will describe in a moment, a lengthy period of history in which the Jews fought, often successfully, against their enemies. But these books were in foreign languages. They had to be translated, and they were translated. One of these translations was one of the most classic. I think the classic one is by this individual, Avraham Kahana. Avraham Kahana was born in Russia in the 19th century. I think it was 1867 he was born, and he was self-taught. He taught himself classical languages and Hebrew and what have you, and he came to Eretz Yisrael eventually. He passed away, I think, in 1946. In the Minyanam. He was a gentleman with a huge beard, and he was very knowledgeable in these kinds of fields, and he wrote this excellent work, a translation from the foreign languages, usually Greek, back into Hebrew with lots of notes and what have you. 2 volumes. But there are other translations as well, one by someone called Hartom, and there's, I think, something else as well, I don't recall, more recent. So this has been around for a long time, this version. And this is exactly what the Zionist movement needed. They needed to remind the Jewish people who they were, what they had been, what they can be again, and that their young people, fighting populate the age of those people of a fighting age, a military age, should know about these events and should be enthused and inspired by them. And that's exactly what happened. The Hashmonaim, the Maccabees, became heroes of all people who supported Zionism. It's no accident that we have Kupat Cholim Maccabi, right? And we have more than a few sports teams called Maccabi, right? Maccabi this, Maccabi that, Tel Aviv, I don't know, I'm not an expert, but there are plenty of sports teams that begin with Maccabi. Okay?
International.
Right. And we have a city right on the so-called Green Line called Maccabim Re'ut, right? There's a reason for that, because it's right next to Modi'in, which is where the Hashmonaim came from. And we have, there's another town called Hashmonaim, etc., etc. If you ask most children nowadays, even today, although the situation is deteriorating, as I will presently explain, you ask most children if they know who Yehuda Maccabi was, hopefully they'll tell you they've heard of him. They won't know much more, but they've heard the name, maybe, hopefully. But you should know, and you may be surprised to know this. 200 years ago, if you asked your average not average, almost any Jewish child on the planet. Have you heard of Yehuda Maccabee? The answer with who? Who is that? I never heard of this guy. Why? He's not mentioned in Midrashim, he's not mentioned in the Mishnah, he's not mentioned in the Talmud. The most he knows is that in Ara Nisim it says something about Matithyahu ben Yohanan, Kohen Gadol. He wasn't actually a Kohen Gadol. Kohen Hashmael Vano. That's all he knows. Or he also perhaps heard about the statement in Masechet Shabbat in the Talmud Bavli Daf Kaf Aleph that Malchut Bet Hashmona Nisahum, when they overcame the Greeks and they entered the Mikdash and they couldn't find oil, the famous story, Nespach Hashemen. That's what he knows. He didn't know anything else. Yehuda Maccabee was unknown. It's hard to imagine. But the Christians, at least the more learned Christians, many of them knew Judas Maccabeus. Everyone heard of him, right? And there were books about him in the Bible, or some versions of the Bible. This was big news to Jews. So there was such a thing called, there's Maccabees and Yehuda Maccabee, and he fought and he won and he did this and he did that. This was big news to the Jewish people. And it took off like a wildfire. These books were translated into Hebrew, and they became almost part of the Zionist canon. But even pre-state, right? Many Jews in Eretz Yisrael and elsewhere were reading these translations, and were identifying with what they saw here. And that's the third period, historical period we can speak of with regards to these texts. Initially they were written by Jews and read by Jews, and everyone was very happy and excited by it, and they were known. Then they were hidden by other Jews, by the Chachamim, because of other considerations, and I'll give it a couple more examples of such considerations. And then the third period was the beginning of the Zionist period, where it was considered necessary and desirable to know about these things, and it became known and was spoken about and read. And even before the State of Israel was established, and certainly after the State of Israel was established, first of all, Tanakh was an important and central part of the curriculum. I have a second cousin who was, well, technically he was born in Australia, but I think he left at the age of 1 month, and he grew up in Tel Aviv, and older than myself, and he's told me on more than one occasion, and he grew up in a very secular family. It wouldn't be not to put too fine a point to it, both his parents were complete atheists. He was brought up as a complete atheist. But he went to school, a regular Israeli secular school in Tel Aviv. Every day they learned Tanakh, and he had to have a kippah in what was called then a yalkut, the school bag. Now it would be called a tik, right? In his yalkut he had to have a kippah which he had to put on his head during Tanakh class, every day, okay? Nowadays, the outgoing Israeli education minister, Dr. Shasha Biton, decided that Tanakh is not really it's not necessary to learn Tanakh to get Bagrut, to matriculate from high school. Not so important. And certainly if you do learn any Tanakh, you certainly don't need to bring a kippah, right? That goes without saying. So just show you how much things have changed over the years. Not so many years, but several decades, things have changed immensely. Just as Tanakh was a central part of the curriculum, every Israeli child learned Tanakh, at least at the beginning of the state, shall we say in the 50s, 60s. Sefer Hashmonaim was also, these books were also they were taught in schools. Dr. Hagi Ben Artzi, for example, states that he recalls, just as we have today a Hidon Tanakh, right, some kind of a quiz, a competition where people are asked to demonstrate their familiarity with the text of the Tanakh, and whether they ask any question, they'll know where it is, and they'll quote entire psukim at you. Shel HaMevugarim, ken, nachon. In the same way, they had a Hidon Hashmonaim. זה ידעת? שמעת את זה?
לא.
הוא אומר שהוא זוכר שבבית ספרו, חגי בן ארצי אומר את זה, היה חידון על ספר חשמונאים. הוא אפילו זכה, הוא עצמו זכה בזה פעם אחת.
חתני תנ"ך כמה וכמה במשפחה הזאת.
כן, אוקיי, אבל היה לא רק בתנ"ך, היה גם בספרי חשמונאים, זה היה חלק מסדר הלימודים.
וואו.
But then what happened? And now we enter the current period. So for quite some time, the younger generation in Eretz Yisrael, before the state and after the establishment of the state, was familiar with the Tanakh to some extent, familiar with the Hashmonaim, and very proud of the Hashmonaim. These were great models to emulate and to look up to. But then they began to notice something very disturbing. That all these Hashmonaim were religious fanatics. They kept Shabbat. They rededicated a mikdash. They tore down all the avodah zarah. They forcibly circumcised Jewish children who had not been circumcised because the parents were scared of being caught with their circumcised child and being executed, which happened plenty. If you understand why they were worried, they went around from town to town, as it says here explicitly, and they forcibly circumcised Jewish children. These are fanatics, right? These are right-wing mitnachalim, racist, fascist, xenophobic fanatics, right? There's no question about it. And you want us to identify with these characters? This is already now we're talking about the late 60s into the 70s. So now the Israeli youth are more into the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and worse, and therefore, these people just don't fit into that milieu at all. So this is not for us. And all of a sudden, Israeli children are not studying Sefer Hashmonaim, and over time they're studying less and less Tanakh. By now, it's disastrous. How little Tanakh is taught, and if it's taught from the perspective of higher criticism. So really, they're not learning Tanakh; they're learning the theories of various professors who have to justify their existence every so often by coming up with a new theory and a new thesis, whatever, and they change the curriculum every couple of years to fit in with the most recent thesis. It's the same with teaching English, by the way, which is why Israeli kids don't learn English, because every 3 years is a new way of teaching English, and none of these ways work. But someone has to make money, and someone has to justify why this person's been working on a new way of teaching English for 5 years. So there you have it. So today we're in a situation where, once again, despite the fact that it's right here before us in Hebrew, most Jews know nothing about what these books say. Almost nothing. And that's why I recommend again highly, because I know that most people are going to find it difficult to read these texts in the original, Hashmonaim Aleph, Bet, and Yosef and Matityahu, although Josephus exists in English, no question. And there's a there's a translation of the second book of the Maccabees in English, because I know that because I have it. Of the first there probably is as well. I haven't seen it, I don't have it, but maybe it exists. So you could read some of these things in English, I'm sure. But for many people it would be difficult. There's lots of details, lots of extraneous detail, lots of explanations, which are very fascinating, but most people want a more concise version. So Hagi Ben Arsi wrote this thing called Megillat Hanukkah, which you can order online. 8 chapters, 1 chapter per day, and he does a tremendous job. And it's very important, I think, that everyone gets their hands on such a thing and actually studies it. I'm not suggesting to study it 8 hours a day. For every day, hours a day, you have to study Torah. But to know the history of the Jewish people, to know why there is Hanukkah, why we say Anisim, and to understand, just as the Maharal understood in his work Miswa on Hanukkah, where he explains that it's clear that 8 days of Hanukkah, the celebration, would not have been instituted because of Nes Pach Hashemin. Just as he understood that, we all have to understand that. But that's not what most people today understand. Most from Jews who celebrate Hanukkah today think it's all about Nes Pach Hashem, which is actually completely wrong. And it's important that we understand this. So I recommend, first of all, that you get this book and you study it. Make time for it. Or any other text that you can get your hands on that will help you know about what was going on in those days. You also, again, I also recommend the writings of Yosef and Matityahu, Josephus Flavius, which I know exist in English. He wrote them originally in Greek, maybe also in Latin, probably in Greek. And his books also were preserved by the Christian churches, and that's also why we have them again, and that's why you can read them in Hebrew today. But they also exist in English. So let me give you now as brief as I can make it, a brief summary of the history of these events. You've all heard of Alexander the Great, Alexander Mokdon, Alexander the Macedonian. His father, Philippos, and also a very unpleasant character. The history is full of unpleasant characters. Philippos was another. He was drunk most of the time, but he was also very good at creating a great standing army which was able to conquer all of the Greek tribes and city-states, what have you, and he made it into one kingdom. And then he was assassinated. And Alexander, at the very, very young age of about, I think, 22 or 3, something like that, maybe 21, I think it was 23, he became the head of this new Greek, Macedonian Greek kingdom. And he was a very talented military leader. And his father's, Philippos's dream had been to conquer the Persian Empire, which was the largest, most powerful empire at the time, stretching from Persia, the borders of India to the east, and all the way to Turkey, all of Turkey, Asia Minor in the west, right up against abutting Greece. And they had attacked the Greeks on several occasions. So the Greeks had reason to want to deal with these Persians, but they were an immense empire. So Alexander, I think, was after 2 years, he consolidated his rule, and he marched off with a very large army, but much smaller than the opposing Persian army eventually, I think about 1/3 in size. And at the Battle of Gilgamesh, he met Darius, one of those Dariawashim, there are a number of them, and he beat them, which was a big surprise to everybody, maybe even to himself. And he all of a sudden now was the ruler of the largest empire that the world had ever seen. All of the Persian Empire, and now all the way up to, as we said, up to the borders of Greece, and now this included also southern Europe, Greece, Macedonia, Albania. So he found himself now the head of this immense empire. And the Greeks always had this. When was this? This was, I think it was 333. He began his campaign, BCE, Leminyanum, and he died 10 years later in 323. What he died of? Hard to say. He was a young man in his early to mid-30s. Either he drank himself to death, which is quite possible, or he picked up a fever in one of those rivers on the borders of India, which was also common, or he was assassinated or poisoned. No one knows. And his empire now was divided basically into four, but let's say 3 parts. There was three generals took over this empire of his, and one called Antigonos took over the western part of the empire, basically Greece, Macedonia, maybe up to northern Italy. And that really doesn't interest us, because that went its own way, and that's not part of our discussion. The eastern part of the empire was divided between 2 generals. One was called Ptolemy, or in our terminology, Talmai. He took over Egypt, the capital of which had been made Alexandria. No prize for guessing who named it that. And that was a very powerful country, because it was the breadbasket of the ancient world in many ways. The Romans could not survive without the wheat they got from Egypt, which is why they turned it into a vassal state very quickly. And the eastern part of the empire, which is southern Turkey, what we call today Syria, Lebanon, and further east into Iraq even, was taken over by the Seleucid kingdom, Selvekim. So, and Eretz Yisrael found itself right in the middle of these 2 kingdoms. You have Egypt, the Egyptian Ptolemaic kingdom to the south, and you have the Seleucid kingdom to the north, and Eretz Yisrael is right in between. And of course both of them wanted to rule Eretz Yisrael, because obviously it belongs to them. So For a long time it was under the control of the Ptolemaic kingdom. That was till the year 199 BCE, basically 200. And from that time on it was basically under the Seleucid kingdom's rule. Now we all know that the Greeks, being convinced that their culture, their civilization was superior to all others, they would be doing everyone a great favor if they managed to Hellenize everybody else. So that's what they did. And most of the nations were willing to go along with this. But of course the troublesome Jews were not so eager to become part of the Hellenized world. But there are always Jews who will go along with such things, especially if it's worth their while. So there was an upper class of merchants, powerful businessmen, tax farmers, tax collectors, which is a very lucrative position in the kingdom, etc., who they rubbed shoulders all the time with the Syriac Greeks, or Greco-Syrians, and called Greco-Syrians because they were Greeks, but they ruled in Syria, so Antioch was their capital. And they were quite happy to become Hellenized and turn their backs on the Torah, which many of them did. We don't have exact figures. My impression is that by the time you get to the revolt of the Hashmonaim, which began in the year 167 BCE, Leminyanam, my guess is between 15 and 30% of the Jewish people were pretty much dedicated Hellenists. So at the very end of the 3rd century, at the end of the the 3rd century and into the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, you had Antiochus III, the Great, and he basically took over Eretz Yisrael from the Ptolemies, made it part of his kingdom, and then the hero of our plot, Antiochus IV, his son, took over, and around 175 BCE, something like that, began a policy of increased Hellenization. Most of the Jewish people were opposed. Most of the Jewish people were farmers. They lived in the hills, in the towns, in the villages. They weren't interested in what was going on in the Greek cities. There you had Greek culture. So the Jews who lived there, who were involved in commerce and trade and government, they were influenced by all these things. And סליחה, יש עוד תה במקרה? תודה רבה. The policy was instigated by Jews, or encouraged very much by Jews. It states here in Maccabees Aleph, and it states, Bayamim Ahem, at that time, Yasa'u Mikarav Yisrael, there were Jews, B'nei V'liya'al, that is the term used by these texts to refer to the Hellenized Jews. The term Hellenist doesn't exist anywhere in these texts, anywhere in Chazal. This is the 1st chapter. Pasuk Yud Aleph, verse Yud Aleph 11. The term used by the people who wrote these texts who were not Hellenists, they referred to these Hellenized Jews as B'nei V'liya'al, in other words, evildoers, or poshe'im, criminals. That's the term they use. That's why the correct, or the most ancient nusach in Al Nisim is Rabim Biyad Ma'atim, etc. Rabim Biyad Ma'atim, Tumim Biyad Turim, Roshaim Biyad Sadiqim, or Foshe'im Biyad Osei Torah. That is the nusach of Sa'id Gaon, of the Rambam, and many other sources. The term Hellenist was invented by 19th century historians. So it says that these Jews, they increased their activities to win over more Jews to their policy, which was, they tried to convince others to join them, which was, they said, let us go and basically, be like the Goyim, learn from them, accept their civilization, their culture. From the day that we have been separate from them, terrible things have happened to us. It's always the case that these kinds of Jews will always tell you that Am Yisrael's problems are because we are not like the other nations. Whereas the Torah and the Torah Jews will always tell you it's the opposite. The Nevi'im will always tell you the opposite. The reason for our problems is because we have been learning too much from these other nations. But they saw it the other way around. Our problem is that we're not more like these Greeks. Then, Pasuk Yod Gimel, Vayelechu el HaMelech, and they went to tell the king that, we're happy to work with you and get this policy of Hellenization going. And so he gave them the green light. They built a gymnasium, which was just one kind of building or institution that was a part of any self-respecting Greek polis, any Greek city. You had to have a gymnasium. There were two kinds of gymnasiums. The kind that people would wrestle and engage in sporting activities whilst dressed, and another kind where you had to be naked to do so. To be naked also meant that if you were circumcised, you couldn't really show yourself there, because that was a tremendous embarrassment. And that's why it goes on to say, وَيَعْسُ لَهِمْ عُرْلَةً. So those who wanted to be accepted in these circles, they had to actually undergo a terrible operation to try and reinvent an orla that had been removed, a foreskin. And these people were very happy to do the bidding of these Greeks, and they would also, of course, inform against their brethren, who's really opposing these policies. You should take care of this guy, whatever. So, now it should be mentioned at this point. It's not mentioned here in detail, but it's mentioned in other places that the Kohen HaGadol at this period, originally, the high priest, his name was Honio. Honio, which in English is Onias. And he was okay. He was a loyal Jew, from what we know. He wasn't willing to go along with these Greek things, these Greek ideas, these policies. Now, being the Kohen Gadol in those days was not just a religious function. It was also actually carried a tremendous amount of political and financial power as well. The Kohen Gadol was essentially the ruler of the Jewish settlement, the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. He was also represented them vis-a-vis the government, and he was responsible for collecting taxes and what have you. And he was also in charge, as Kohen Gadol, he was in charge of the Mikdash, of the temple. And within the temple there were many treasures. There was a lot of wealth that had been stored in the Mikdash over the generations. And there was another Kohen by the name of Jason, not a very Jewish name. That tells you something about him. He wasn't that Jewish. And he wanted to be Kohen Gadol. So he went to the authorities and he said to them, "I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. I will pay you lots of money, a bribe, which usually works, and I will also help you institute all these policies, because really I agree with you. We need to get away from this Jewish this Judaism and the Torah and all these things. We need to become more like you guys, and I'll help you promote this here in Yerushalayim, which is the center piece of the Jewish settlement in Eretz Yisrael." And he did. So he got the job. So they got rid of Honio, and Yason became the new Kohen Gadol. You can also imagine that many Jews were up in arms. Not only that, he took from the temple treasures, from the Osarot HaMikdash, and used that to bribe officials. He used that money to build gymnasiums and theaters and all sorts of Greek things to change the face of Yerushalayim. And eventually, that's exactly what happened. He, and even more the person who followed him, changed the face of Yerushalayim. They turned it into a city that was almost unrecognizable as a Jewish city. It became a place of Greek Avodah Zarah, Greek culture, Greek practices, which meant all sorts of things, by the way, including, and this may sound familiar to you from the present day, including male prostitutes walking the street, excuse me, but that went on. That was part of the Greek system. That was part of what was going. That was normal and accepted. That's what they were doing in Yerushalayim. There was another Kohen, although according to some source, he wasn't actually even a Kohen, but he was from Shevet Binyamin, but we don't really know for sure. So wherever he was, his name was Menelaus, another nice Jewish name, and he was even more of a Hellenizer than Yason. So he went to the authorities and said, this guy Yason, he's okay, but he doesn't know how to get the job done. I'm a real Hellenist. I'll really get the job done for you. In fact, I'm going to introduce reforms into the Mikdash, into the temple. So they said, that's a good deal. And how much are you going to pay? Well, I'll pay a whole lot. So he bribed his way into the office of, he was the new Kohen Gadol, Menelaus. Wonderful. More and more Jews were fleeing Yerushalayim. They couldn't stay there any longer. They couldn't stand it, they couldn't bear it, or they were being literally driven out. And around this time, 168 BCE, approximately, was when the major decrees were made against the Jews. That is to say, not keeping Shabbat, prohibiting Berith Milah, circumcision, prohibiting Kiddush HaHodesh. If you have no Jewish calendar, you have no Hagim, etc. And probably it also included Shabbat, but it's not mentioned there explicitly, but who knows, probably. And this was the time, 168, 167 BCE, when the various stories that we have, including in some of these writings and other sources, we find mention of many cases of martyrdom. Jews who refused to worship Avodah Zarah, Jews who refused to eat pork, etc. The famous story about Hannah and her 7 sons, which is related in these texts, where each son in turn was told, if you agree to eat this pork or whatever, then we'll pay you, we'll do this, we'll give you a great job. They all refused to do so. This is not a story, this is not a legend, this is for real. There were many, many Jews throughout the land, because their policy was to go from town to town and force people to worship Avodah Zarah, transgress the Torah, to wipe out, to eradicate Yahadut. And there were many Jews who were willing to be martyrs rather than do this. This is the first time in Jewish history where we hear of mass martyrdom. Okay, there is the example in Sefer Daniel earlier of martyrdom, but that's just 3 specific people. Here we're talking about thousands and thousands of people. Women who were caught with a baby that had been circumcised, that woman would be dragged through the streets by horse, tied or attached in some fashion, who knows, with what, with nails, I don't know, to the wall of Yerushalayim, and the baby would be hung on her body with a rope, etc., and they would be left to rot there for a long time. This was the policy. They were determined to make this work, and this went on for approximately a year. These kinds of goings on and these acts of martyrdom, and it's around that time that the real revolt began, because it relates here. What I just said to you here is mentioned here explicitly in
chapter 1.
The end of chapter 1, Pasuk Samech 60. Weth hanoshim asher molu et benehem, the women who had circumcised their children, hemithu al pi hapekuda, they executed. Vayithlu et ha'olalim b'sabarehem, they hanged the babies by their necks, with bnei vatehen, and all the household. With hamalim utham, and those who had circumcised them, hemithu, they executed. That's mentioned here, for example. Now, this is where Matityahu and his family enter the picture. They lived in Modi'in. They were Kohanim from the Mishmeret of Yehoyariv. They were not from the family of not from one of the major Kohanic families. They were not a family of Kohanim Gedolim, but they were respected Kohanim, apparently originally from Yerushalayim, but they had moved to Modi'in. And the policy was to go from town to town with the Greek officials and a detail of soldiers and coerce the Jews in this town to they built an altar, and you would have to they would slaughter and sacrifice a pig to Zeus, the Greek god, etc. And they also went to the most important man in the town to do this, to show that if he's giving in, then we'll all have to give in. We have no choice. They went up to Matityahu. This is in chapter 2, Perek Beth, and they told him, "Go ahead. It's your job to do it, and you'll be paid and honored, and don't worry, you'll be taken care of." Wayan Matityahu said, "Vayomer v'kol gadol." He was an elderly man by this. We don't know exactly, but he wasn't a young man. Im kol ha'amim asher bevet malchut hamelech shoma'im lo. If all the peoples in the kingdom wish to follow the king, yasuru kol ish mi'avodat avotho, let them all abandon the practice of their forefathers, vayivharu b'misvothao, and choose to do what the king says. However, wa'ani uvanai, I and my sons, my brothers, my family, nelech bivrith avothenu, we will follow the traditions of our forefathers. Halino lanu la'azov Torah u'misvoth. Under no circumstances will we abandon the Torah and the misvoth. When he finished saying these words, there was another Jew who was willing to do the deed. So he walked up to the altar to do it. And he decided that this is it. I have to take a radical step. Now I have to do the following. I have to execute this person in front of everybody. And he killed this Jew who was willing to do this on the altar that had just been built for this purpose. He killed him. He also killed the Greek official. Doesn't say exactly how he did it, whether he was an expert in martial arts or he grabbed someone's, I don't know, he did it. He killed these two people, the Jew and this Greek official. And he cried out to all the people who had been gathered to witness, وَيِكْرَى مَتِثْيَاهُ بَعِيرْ بِقَوْلْ گَذَوْلْ لَمُرْ كَوْلْ هَمِكَنَى لَتُرَى هَوَمَدْ بَرِيثْ يَلَيْخْ أَحْرَى. Everyone who wishes to remain loyal to the Torah, follow me. And they all fled. Sefer Maccabees, Perek Beth. And they had to flee the city of Modi'in. They had to leave behind all their belongings, their home, etc., because they knew that the next day a huge number of Greek soldiers would show up and destroy them. So they had to flee to the hills, which is what they did. And from that time on, from 167 BCE, this is when this took place, for about 2 years, there was an ongoing rebellion which involved a lot of guerrilla warfare, but also even some more serious, more semi-pitched battles. And Yehuda Maccabee, and shortly after this, Matityahu died. He wasn't killed by anyone, but either he suffered because of the difficult conditions, living in caves and living on the run, fleeing, or because he was elderly, became sick. And he announced what each of these of his 5 sons should do. So he said, Yehuda, he was the middle, the third son. He had 5 sons. Yohanan, Elazar, Yehuda, Shimon, and Jonathan.
אתמול שמעתי שיהודה הוא הבכור.
לא, הוא השלישי לפי מה שידוע לי.
לא נכון.
אוקיי, טוב, בסדר.
אגב, אתמול, אם כבר הפרעתי, הלכתי אצל חברה, אם תצאת את הדין. הלכתי אצל חברה שיוצאת קודשין. היא סיפרה שאצלם בבית, המנהג של העדה, לקרוא בשבת של חנוכה, קטעים ממגילה שהם קראו לה מגילת אנטיוך.
כן, כן, מוכר. התימנים נהגו לקרוא בו.
גם תימנים?
כן, כן. אני לא יודע אם היום עדיין מחזיקים במנהג, אבל כן. הרב גפך, מורנו הרב יוסף גפך זצ"ל, הוא הוציא כחלק מספר דניאל, מהדורה של ספר דניאל פירוש רב סעדיה, אז בסוף יש מגילת אנטיוכוס בנוסח תימן מקורי, בארמית.
באיזה ספר?
יש ספר דניאל עם פירוש רס"ג, שהוציא מורי הרב קפה, ושם בסוף הוא הדפיס גם מגילת אנטיוכוס, שנכתב במקור בארמית, ויש גם תרגום עברי. זה גם מופיע בסידור נוסח אשכנז שיש לי, אבל היום זה לא מוכר, וזה גם לא שווה הרבה למען האמת, כי זה סתם אגדות. זה נחמד, אבל זה אגדות, מעשיות, זה לא קשור לשום היסטוריה.
קראנו את זה אתמול, ומה שמעניין זה שזה כמעט חוזר טקסטואלית, כמו מגילת אסתר.
כן, בהרבה דברים, כן.
המון ביטויים של מגילת אסתר מופיעים שם, אז זה לשמוע את זה כמו לשמוע את המן
זה כנראה חובר בתחילת תקופת הגאונים, משהו כזה, כנראה.
ממש דומה.
כן.
למגילת אסתר.
אני יודע שיהודי תימן נהגו לקרוא בו. אני חושב שהיום זה די נשכח מלב. אני חושב שהיום זה נשכח מלב.
זה לא נמצא בסידורים.
בסידורי תימן רגילים לא ראיתי.
כן, לא, גם אני לא. אוקיי.
יש לי, שוב אני אומר, יש לי נוסח סידור יקי, נוסח אשכנז אמיתי, לפני איזה 120 שנה, 50 שנה אולי. סידור עבודת ישראל זה נקרא. יש סידור ידוע, מאוד מדויק, מיוחד, ושם יש מגילת אנטיוכוס בעברית.
כן.
תורגם ללשון הקודש. זה מודפס שם.
ואתה קראת וזכור לך שזה נשמע כמו מגילת אסתר?
כן, 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 נכון, כן. So, what's the time, by the way?
Rehabilitation.
Okay, so we'll have to
You mentioned the
wrap
five
up.
sons.
There were 5 sons. Yehuda was made the military leader because Matityahu said he knows how to lead you militarily. He said, and this is what he said to his sons before he died, very, very inspiring. He was about to pass away. Gadar, Zadon, Wathocheha, Vayom Mapecha, Vaharon Af. We live in terrible times. Wa'ata Vanim Kana'u la Torah. Be zealous for the Torah. Uthanu nafshotechem al berith avotechem. And give your lives if necessary for the Torah. And to save our people. And he goes on to say, and he mentions Avraham and the Akedah and Yosef in Mitzrayim and Pinahas with the act of Kana'uth that we know about, Yoshua. And Kalev, who were willing to act differently from the other Meraglim, and mentions David. He goes through many characters in the Tanakh, many people we know from the Tanakh, Eliyahu, Daniel. This is the speech according to what we have here that he made, and he says, Hine Shimon Achichem, who was the fourth of the brothers. He will be your father. Father doesn't mean a father, it means your advisor. Yehuda Maccabee Gibor Hayil, he's a fighter. He will be your military leader. And he died. And Yehuda became the leader of this revolt. This revolt, without going into all the details because we can't do this now, we have much detail here about the various battles and how Yehuda led this revolt for 2 years to the year 165 BCE, at which point they were able to, this is after a time of period of at least 3 or 4 years where no Jews had been allowed into Yerushalayim or near the Mikdash. Yerushalayim was Judenrein, okay? Now that they were able to re-enter, they had just succeeded in one of their battles. Yehuda Maccabee fought 8 battles against the Greeks. 7, he was victorious. The 8th, unfortunately, not so. We'll get to that in a moment. After one of these battles, they got to Yerushalayim. That's when the events that we celebrate on Hanukkah specifically took place at that time, in the year 165 BCE. They rededicated the Mikdash. What does that mean? Why do you mean rededicate? What's the problem with the Mikdash? The Mikdash had been turned into a Beit Avodah Zarah. They had placed an idol of Zeus in the Mikdash on the altar or next to it. They had sacrificed to Avodah Zarah. So this huge thing called the Mizbeach, which is a large object made of stone, has to be dismantled. All those stones which were once a proper Mizbeach and now they're pasul, They cannot be used. They had to be not thrown away. They had to be ganuz. They were placed in some special chamber in some underground place in the Mikdash, and they were hidden away. They were never touched again. You had to build a new mizbeach, which takes time, at least a week. Get the stones, build it, all the rest of it. That's exactly why the first thing they were able to perform when they re-entered the Mikdash was Hadlakat HaMenorah, Hadlakat HaNer, which is also part of the Avodah HaMikdash on a daily basis. Why? Because to light an oil lamp is not a complicated thing. They did not have a menorah made of solid gold because that had been stolen by the Greeks. So what did they do? It says in Megillat Ta'anith, they made a menorah from pig iron, basic simple iron and wood, somehow hobbled it together, and they created a new menorah. And to this day, that's the halacha, that if there is no way of producing a solid gold menorah as described in the Torah, you make it from whatever materials you have. So they made we learned this halacha from this event. They created a menorah and they began to light candles in the menorah. That was the first thing. That also therefore became the symbol of the return to the Mikdash and the symbol of their victory. So this is a great event, and these are the events that we mention in Al Hanisim and speaking about. That's why it's called Hanukkah. The word Hanukkah means to dedicate, or rededicate the Mikdash to its proper purpose. That's what the word Hanukkah means. Lahanoch. Right, lahanoch is to dedicate, to set aside for a particular purpose, and to introduce into use, to begin to enter something into its proper use. Like hanoch lana'ar al pi darko, right? So this was after 2 years of fighting, which again most people don't know. 2 years is a long time. The country was in turmoil. The conditions were very difficult. But this did not last for very long, because 4 years later, in the year 161 BCE, was the 8th battle that Yehuda had to fight against the Greeks, and he was this time, unlike other times, he was surprised. He was taken unawares by a Greek general called Bakhides, who normally the Greeks would come towards Yerushalayim from the north, west, or south. And Yehuda would be aware of what they were planning, so he would be able to call up his reserves. He didn't have a standing army, you have to understand. This came later. As he had to have time to assemble his army. In this case, he only had 800 soldiers, and Bakhides came with, I think, 30,000 or something, and he had no chance. And they were wiped out. Yehuda Maccabi, unfortunately, was wiped out with all of his 800 troops. And that was the 8th battle, which was a complete rout. Because this time Bakhides came from the east, or through the near the Jordan Valley, and surprised them. Okay. So after 4 years from the return to the Mikdash, the situation was not only as it had been before the revolt, it was actually worse than it had been before the revolt. Who says this? Yosef Matityahu, Josephus says this explicitly. He says the situation now was worse than ever before, because all the people who had supported the revolt and had fought for the Maccabees, and all the people who were known to resist this new ideology, they were all executed. And again, Yerushalayim, you couldn't be there. And at this point, they built. I think it was at this point the Greeks built the Hakra. The Hakra was a fortress built right up against the southern wall of Har HaBayit. Where the Sharei Hulda are today, right, where there's an archaeological park or dig or whatever. You won't find it there today for the simple reason that later the Hashmonaim destroyed it completely, razed it to the ground, so you can't find it, but that's where it stood. Why did they build a fortress there? Because they needed a garrison of Greek troops, to protect the Mikdash from these fanatical, did we mention fanatical, racist, fascist, settler, xenophobic Jews? Well, he had to protect Yerushalayim from these people, obviously. It's nothing to do, it's not theirs, why should they come and be there? And they also had to protect the Hellenist Jews, because if they didn't have the Greeks protecting them, the other Jews would kill them. It was very simple. So they had to have a garrison of troops there to protect their allies, the Hellenist Jews. which was the high priest and all these wealthy aristocratic merchant families, etc., tax farmers. So the situation was a complete disaster at this point, and it would have been quite natural and normal for almost any person to just give up and despair. However, that's not what happened. The leader, the new leader of the revolt, was now the youngest brother, Jonathan. And Elazar had been killed in battle earlier. He was the one who got under an elephant and stabbed it from below and was crushed by the elephant, and that's how they won one battle. So Yehuda had been killed, Elazar had been killed, and you had now Yohanan, Shimon, and Jonathan. Jonathan was the youngest brother. He became the leader. He was an amazing leader. Yehuda, a Maccabee, led this revolt for 6 years until he was killed in 161. Jonathan led this revolt for 18 years.
Wow.
Till in what year was he? He was killed by subterfuge. He made only one mistake, Jonathan. He won every battle. I'll tell you something else that he did, which is important to know. He made one mistake. He allowed Trifon, this Greek general, I hope I'm getting the names right. He allowed him to enticed him to come and sign a peace agreement in Akkor. He said, well, rather than fight any longer, we'll make a peace agreement. So he and his two sons and other people went with him to Akkor to sign an agreement. Of course, as soon as they got to Akkor, they fell upon them and killed them all. So Jonathan was also killed now. That left Shimon, and Shimon completed what had to be done. And he defeated and drove Trifon out of Eretz Yisrael, and only then, in the year 142 BCE, Leminyanam, was the independent state of the Hashmonaim actually established. It's a long time. That's 25 years after the initial revolt. And these are things that people don't know, and we should know, and we need to know these things. So we're talking about we're talking about a generation. 25 years is a generation, basically. You had an entire generation grew up within this situation of war and strife and destruction and persecution. It was only in 142 that the independent Jewish state, Hashmonaim state, was established, and it only lasted till the Romans showed up in 66 BCE. Rambam, interestingly, by the way, was not familiar with all this historical information. He didn't have any way of knowing these things. So he writes in Ilchot Megillah Hanukkah that as a result of the original revolt, the Hazra Malchut Yisrael K'matayim Shana, that the Jewish people became independent for 200 years. That's actually not precise, because 200 years is basically counting from the time of the revolt to the time of the Churban Bayit Sheni, which is 200 odd years or more, but in fact that's not what happened, not exactly how it was. That's a brief version, at least as brief as I could make it. I hope I didn't bore you all or keep you up too late, but those are the basic facts that we all should know. There's much to read here, much important information. I recommend that the people do look at it and learn it, because Megillat Hanukkah, written by Dr. Hagi Ben Atzi, is more a practical proposition for most people. I recommend you start with that. You can learn one every day of Hanukkah. You can learn one chapter, but also you don't have to wait for Hanukkah. You can get it now and prepare for next Hanukkah. But those are the facts. That's what happened. The Jewish people had a very turbulent, very difficult. Our nation suffered tremendously during that period, and from that period onwards until throughout the Roman period as well, when there were also, as we said, many revolts and uprisings and terrible. The response, the Roman response to those revolts was almost beyond description. We need to know these things and be aware of these things. We can be and should be proud of what our forefathers were able to do at that time. as Chagi Ben Arsi points out, he says people think that the Romans defeated us, but the truth is it was a partial victory for us, a partial victory, because the fact that Antoninus, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, decided to announce that Judaism was now a protected religion and allow the Jews to live as they chose to live in Eretz Yisrael. This was because the Romans could not contain this nation. These people were constantly revolting and causing them tremendous difficulty in running their empire in peace. They were mainly interested in, industrial quiet and taxing everyone to death. As long as you paid taxes, it didn't bother them, you were okay, more or less. But so they were willing to make a deal with the Jews. But had the Jews been more easily defeated and vanquished, then that wouldn't have happened either. So people who think that the Bar Kokhba revolt was an unmitigated disaster are mistaken. It was not a great success in terms of the immediate result, but in historical terms, if you take the long view, even that unsuccessful revolt was actually a partial success, and probably just as crucial to the future of the Jewish people as the events of Hanukkah, because without the events of Hanukkah, without the revolt of the Hashmonaim, the Maccabees, and the rest of the people, they didn't fight by themselves. Most of the Jews supported them and were willing to fight with them. Without that, the Jewish people would have disappeared. There would not be a Jewish people. We would not be here discussing it today. There would be no Hanukkah, and there would be no Torah, and there'd be no such thing. We just become one more unknown, unknowable ethnic collection group within the Greek Empire, which then became part of the Roman Empire. There were many such groups, many such ethnicities, many such nations that disappeared. And Baruch Hashem, we did not go down that path, and that's why we're here to talk about it. So keep that in mind and internalize it, and remember it is important. Tov, we'll end here and we'll daven Arvith.
We had a Nesa Bateria. Nesa Bateria.
Nesa Bateria? Okay, 8 times longer than usual.
What I want to say is that it was very interesting, the fact that hundreds of years of fighting against the Greeks and the Romans was done not in the name of secular nationalism, I must say, but all of those hundreds of years there was a religious fire burning behind it, which is that wasn't quite an astonishing thing. Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.